Okay, so by this point, you should be pretty comfortable with the basic query editing tools, your date tools, your text tools, your number tools. And for the most part, they've all been pretty straightforward, pretty intuitive to use. But there are some pretty interesting, maybe not so intuitive tools available in the query editor as well. And one thing that I want to cover now is the idea of pivoting and unpivoting a table. So the way I describe it, pivoting is kind of just a fancy way to describe the process of turning distinct row values into columns, which is called pivoting, or turning columns into rows, which is called unpivoting. Now, it sounds pretty simple, pretty straightforward on the surface, but it's actually a little bit tricky to get a hang of, at least it was for me. So I'm a visual learner, and what I'm about to show you is what finally caused it to click for me. So imagine this simple two-column table. You've got years in the first column, and you've got a numerical field like unit sales in the second column. If we were to select the year column and pivot this table, we would essentially take the year in each row and turn it into its own column. So now instead of a row for 1994, we have a column for 1994. Same goes for 95, 96, 97, 98. So we've basically flipped that table from a vertical format up to a horizontal format. We've turned rows into columns. Now on the flip side, if we started out with the table in that horizontal format and we selected the years in the first row, we could unpivot to transform it into that vertical form. In other words, we take those years, which had been columns, and transform them into rows. So my little mental tip here is that I imagine that the table is kind of like on a hinge in that upper left corner. Pivoting is like rotating it up from vertical to horizontal, and unpivoting is like rotating it down from horizontal to vertical. Now, one thing to note, there's another tool in the query editor called transpose, and that works in a really similar way, but the difference is that it doesn't recognize unique values. So if you're dealing with a table like the one we're looking at here, where we don't have duplicate years or unit sales, pivoting and transposing would yield the exact same result. But if instead we had two rows of 1994, for instance, pivoting would collapse both of those rows into a single 1994 column, while transposing would preserve both versions and keep two separate columns, each with a 1994 header. So one way to think about it is that transpose is kind of clunkier, it's kind of brute force. It just takes the entire table and it just flips it on its side. So I actually have a little demo file that I'm going to show you because you do have to really see this happening in real time to understand what's going on. So let me show you what that looks like. All right, so this file isn't available as part of the course resources, so just sit back and follow along for this one. I'm going to go ahead and grab my data as a CSV, and I've called this file unpivot demo. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up right here in the query editor. And right off the bat, you can tell this table is a little funky. There's some things wrong with this table. Number one, I don't have column headers, which is not that surprising. The column headers here are actually years. So when Power BI took a look at the sample of this table, it said, okay, you've got numerical values in each column. I have no way of knowing if that's a year or if it's a similar value to the one in row 2 or 3. It's an easy fix. You can just go ahead and click use first row as headers. And there you go. Now our years have been promoted to headers. So we've made one improvement, but this table is still far from ideal. And what we have here is information about unit sales and revenue. We've got two different metrics broken down by year, 94, 95, each as columns. And as an analyst, as someone who needs to take this data and interpret it and analyze it and explore it, this type of table format can create a lot of headaches. Really what we're looking for here is a rectangular table with each dimension or metric as a column and each observation as a row. So ideally, what I want to transform this table into is a format that has 3 columns: year, sales, and revenue. That would give me a format that I could take and plug into my model and analyze in any way that I choose. So let's see if we can do that with our pivoting and unpivoting tools. Now, first things first, I don't like the fact that I have years in columns, so I want to turn these columns into rows. And to do that, I'm rotating down from horizontal to vertical, or unpivoting. So what I can do is go ahead and select all of my year columns, go into transform, and then press this unpivot columns button. And there you go, it's transformed my year columns into year rows. It's labeled that column attribute, which is okay, we'll fix that later. And that hasn't totally solved my problem. I still have unit sales and total revenue as my rows instead of columns, but it's gotten me one step closer. And one thing to note before I move to the next step is that there's another way I could have done that. And let me just remove that step. And instead of selecting all 5 of these year columns, I could have selected this first column and chosen the unpivot other columns option. So you arrive at the exact same place, just another way to get there. So I've gotten a little bit closer. I've got values here, I've got years in a column. The only adjustment I need to make now is turn these unit sales and total revenue labels from rows into columns. So I need to do the reverse of what I just did and take this vertical orientation and pivot it up into a horizontal. So you guessed it, I'm going to select that first column, pivot the column, and this says, okay, where do your values live? Do they live in the attribute column or the value column? In this case, the value column. Press OK, and there you have it. So now we've got first column, which is attribute for year. We can go ahead and name that column year. We've got a unit sales column and a total revenue column. And this is a table format that I can work with as an analyst. So that was a great demo of how both pivot and unpivot can be used to kind of wrestle a messy table format into something more workable. Now, last quick demo here. If I take this all the way back to the start, just delete each of these steps, back to square one, because I'm not dealing with any duplicate values here, I could use transpose in this case as well. And in fact, that's actually a more efficient way to do this. I could select this entire table as is and essentially flip it or rotate it onto its side using that transpose option. So in the transform menu, I can just press transpose here, and that pretty much did the trick. It put years on a column, it put unit sales on a column, and it put revenue on the third column. The only thing we have to do now is use those first rows and promote the headers. And there you go. We've gotten to our same ending point using both combination of pivot and unpivot and transpose. So again, kind of tricky to work with at first, but these tools can be really, really helpful when you need them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and delete that query that I just created. There we go. Close out of the editor. And there you have it, pivoting and unpivoting.